So I'm here with Sarah Green, a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the University of Helsinki. Professor Green holds a PhD in social anthropology from Cambridge University. Before arriving at Helsinki, she was a professor of anthropology at the University of Manchester. Her work focuses on space, place, and location, gender and sexuality, and how borders appear and change, primarily in the Balkans, although she has carried out fieldwork in London and Manchester. Professor Green is the author of Urban Amazons, Lesbian Feminism and Beyond in the Gender, Sexuality, and Identity Battles of London, and Notes from the Balkans, Locating Marginality and Ambiguity in the Greek-Albanian Border, which won the American Anthropological Association's Douglas Prize for the best contribution to Europeanist anthropology. Her most recent book, Border Work, A Visual Journey Through Peripheral Frontier Regions, is a collaboration with photographer Lena Malm. She has also written numerous articles. Professor Green currently leads two research projects, Transit, Time and Travel, and Cross-Locations, which is funded by the European Research Council. In addition, Professor Green is the editor of Social Anthropology. So first, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with us this morning and for your very interesting talk yesterday. So my first question...
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my first question is that you've said before that you're interested in where people are in the world rather than who they are, although the two are interrelated. So what for you are some of the most important contributions a focus on location brings to anthropology?
Okay, well, it's a big question because it's the sort of thing I've been working on for over 25 years now. But I suppose the question comes because when I was working on the Greek-Albanian border a few years ago, it was obvious to me that the biggest problem that those people had didn't really have to do with identity. And everything that I'd read on borders and border issues, migration particularly, but also nationalism, variety of other similar things, seemed to all focus in on this question of identity. And that wasn't the problem for these people. The problem was exactly where the border had been located. They knew who they were. They had no existential angst at all. The problem was that quite often, literally, half of their village was in Albania and the other half was in Greece. And while Albania was a command socialist state, they couldn't get over there. And so the problem was ultimately about the disconnect between their social understanding of where they came from and where they belonged, and the political imposition of a very different idea about where they belonged. And so I began thinking years and years ago about that, and what made me particularly familiar with it was actually the work I was doing earlier for my PhD on radical and revolutionary feminist separatism, because one of the very important things there for people in London who I was looking at, I guess not lots of people would see much connection between feminist separatism and the Greek-Albanian border, but in my mind it worked out that way. And what it was, the spatial aspect, was that separatists in London, which meant the idea of separatism was a separation from men and masculinity, and they lived in the middle of London. And it was, first of all, in practical terms, quite an amazing thing how that was achieved, given that London has quite a lot of men in it. And also, they had this concept of safe space. And I realized very quickly that safe space wasn't just sort of safe from the physical attacks of men or something, but it was safe in terms of what that space contained mentally or intellectually. And that even when women walked in who they regarded, the separatists I was working with, regarded as male identified, for example, that made the space unsafe. And it created a sense of danger, of threat. And so I became aware, even way back then, that how space is organized is a deeply political, social, even economically. It's often very hierarchical. We know that in the way that lecture theatres are organized in universities. And I became very interested in drawing together how people are located in the world with reference to lots of all of the other things that are going on. And I felt that because of the years and years and years and years of focus on identity issues, on who people are, that there hadn't been enough of a focus on where they were, and the importance of that socially and culturally.
So you've sort of answered my second question, but maybe you can talk a little more about how you got from looking at women in London to border areas in the Balkans. It seems like, as you've already said, there's some overlap.
But disconnect,
it seems like...
Well, everything in life is slightly accidental and slightly on purpose, and everybody who works in academics knows that it's quite a precarious activity, and you never can be sure what the next thing is, especially when at the early career stage. And when I finished my PhD, I was very fortunate to get a junior research fellowship at Cambridge, which was actually to look at something completely different. But somebody sent me an email from when I was an undergraduate, a professor of archaeology, who said, "We need an anthropologist who speaks Greek to come to the Greek-Albanian border for the summer. We'll pay for your trip, and we want you to interview a few folk about land degradation." Well, I didn't know anything about land degradation. I had been to that area before as an undergraduate because I took a joint degree in archaeology and anthropology, which is unusual for the UK. I mean, four-field thing doesn't usually exist in the UK, but it does at Cambridge. But I didn't, and I just thought, oh, well, free summer holiday. But then the kinds of questions that I was set to study for that summer holiday, for that research project, which was called Archimedes, Archaeology and Desertification in the Mediterranean Region. It was a big multidisciplinary project. And I was just supposed to ask people, it's a very tectonically active area, what they did about the fact that the ground moves under their feet quite a lot. And the answers I was getting so confused me that I asked to stay on longer, because I was really intrigued, because they basically said they didn't have any land degradation problems, and there weren't any. And we were often standing on a field that the guy owned, half of which had dropped half a metre the previous year. And I say, I'm fluent in Greek, so it was just confusing. And I asked to stay on, and they let me stay on, and one thing led to another, really. But inevitably I drew on the interests I had in space and location and mapping that I developed during my work on lesbian feminism, which was also an accident. Actually, I was originally supposed to go and study Tamil separatism in southern India, because I'd specialised in South Asia as an undergraduate. And I couldn't, because things were really heating up, and I was not given permission to go because they thought I might not come back. So I studied a different kind of feminism, or separatism rather. Separatism in London instead.
So in your most recent book, Border Work, as well as in your cross-locations project, you collaborate with a photographer. What do you see are the advantages of these kinds of cross-disciplinary collaborations?
I think this is a really interesting question, particularly at the moment, because there is a lot of political and sometimes university hierarchy pressure for interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity or whatever. And I have to say I find that pressure a little bit annoying, because I don't think it's very... I don't think it's been started by academics. I think it was started for different reasons that has to do with policies about this, that, or the other thing. I think academic life has always collaborated where the research question brings you, and disciplines bud out of other ones all the time. When you're just following your nose and trying to understand something, and if things push you to look into some other subject, then you do. This idea of kind of mashing disciplines together in order to create some kind of interdisciplinary utopia. It doesn't work. But what I've found in the work that I've done on place and location is that ways of knowing is terribly important. And it's important even, I'd say, to a degree in creating the spaces that people inhabit. And so while I think the material aspects of it and the physical aspects of it are very, very important, I think really ultimately for people, it's what they know that directs how they live and how they experience the world, much more than most other things. So in that sense, I'm not really a phenomenologist, for example. And what a professional photographer can do, and Lena, I worked with her on a project called eSportNet, which was bringing about the eastern peripheries of Europe, is visual media can provide knowledge that is different from textual or vocal or interactive. And stills photography is a particular kind of thing, and why I chose Lena is because she absolutely refuses to illustrate things. She absolutely refuses to use her photography to illustrate what I've discovered as an anthropologist. What she's trying to do is to use the photography to think differently about the same material. And years before, I'd worked on the Greek-Albanian border with a geophysicist who, and I think I'm right in saying, and maybe somebody could contradict me having seen this video, that I'm the only anthropologist who's written not one but two articles co-authored with a geophysicist. And the thing is about, I'd worked with him, Jeff King, who was from the Institut de Physique du Globe in Paris, on the Greek-Albanian border, and realized when he was describing the landscape to me, the mountains were bobbing up and down like yo-yos, lakes were opening and closing, the whole landscape was changing shape because he was working in millions of years and this geophysics understanding of the surface of the earth was completely different either from my understanding or the people I was talking to. And so I realized that is a system of knowledge, an epistemology if you like, geophysics, that allows you to understand a completely different image of what you're looking at and the landscape. And so I began to understand the usefulness of working with other disciplines is it's a way to think otherwise, and in a way that's also a lot of, I think, the best kind of anthropology develops concepts that couldn't be developed without the ethnographic data that you get. That it's not that we kind of take Foucault or Strathern or Salins and think I'll slap a bit of that onto my ethnography. It's more that in an ideal situation, the ethnography will help you to think otherwise, and help you to develop concepts that you can bring back and apply elsewhere. And I think things like photography, geophysics, other disciplines, that's the kind of collaboration that I really appreciate across sectors or disciplines, that helps me to think otherwise.
So, as the editor of Social Anthropology, going in a different direction now, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in current anthropological work, and especially the anthropology of Europe?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. One of the things that I co-edited with a guy called Patrick, God, I've just forgotten his name. I must be jet lagged. La Violette. And the thing is, we were wanting to actually give a little colour stripe to the journal, green and violet, which are actually also the colours of the suffragette movement. Go back to feminism. But they didn't let us do it because it cost too much. But what I was hoping when I started the journal was that we would start having a debate about what European anthropology is and where it's going, And the reason for that was that is anthropology done in any part of the world, but from anthropologists trained in Europe. And what does that mean? Is it in any way different from what's done in the US or in Australia or India or Russia? And I really wanted to open out the debate about where anthropological thinking is going and what makes anthropology possible in today's 21st century world that is very interconnected in a different way from what it used to be when anthropology was invented. And so I was kind of looking around for people to talk about that, and I'm hoping that in the next few years we'll get a bit more. But I think what's coming out thus far for the last couple of years, politics is much more important than it used to be. The political relevance of anthropological thinking and the material that it comes, that's a big issue. Another big issue is we seem to have got past the navel-gazing moment of, how do we know that we know what we know, and is it really about us, and are we wearing enough of a horsehair shirt or not? That seems to have gone past now, which is a bit of a relief because it allows us to pay a little bit more attention to the people we're studying rather than to ourselves. I think there's a lot of experimentation that's trying to go back to things that were maybe dropped before that post and then post-modern, post-structural moment to see whether there's anything to recover from there. I think a lot of these various turns are about that, the ontological turn in particular, which even some of the main people in it, including people like Martin Holbrad, Viveros de Castro, and others, are saying it wasn't really the idea that we should drop the notion that anthropology generates concepts. It's just what's the relationship between that and the people we study, and is that to do with a world that people create that is. There's a lot of debates. So the ontological and a variety of other terms are coming in. I think people are also returning quite strongly to what I was talking about earlier, the idea of drawing from the ethnography what you know, rather than drawing from, various forms of Western philosophy what you know. I think there's some interesting debates just coming up now about the degree to which anthropology is or is not a post-Kantian discipline. Is it a humanist discipline? Is it about liberal humanism in its core? Or should we be going back to some of the pre-Kantian ideas, the Spinozist ideas, the ideas from Deleuze or Latour, or these other people who are quite influenced by a philosophy that isn't critical in the way that the post-Kantian thinkers were. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about that. And then on terms of topics, things like climate, animals, they're coming up a lot in a variety of different ways. There's an increased attention to parts of the world that weren't very strongly studied, like the Arab world and the Caribbean and places that weren't the sort of classic areas for anthropology. And a few, we've still got baby steps, I think, on what to do with new information communications technologies. I think we're still a bit behind from some other disciplines in how to deal with that, let alone big data, which I think scares anthropologists to death. But there are some movements now on how anthropology could make a contribution to understanding the implications of those new technologies.
So just to wrap up, do you have any reading recommendations for people who want to learn more about the themes of yesterday's conference, or what texts have helped shape your own thinking on issues of gender?
I think one of the other keynotes yesterday, well, both of them actually read their stuff, both Agnieszka's work and Eric Fassin. I think I was delighted to see that Eric is here, because I think in anthropology, Eric's brother Didier is much better known in anthropology than Eric. And I think Eric's work really is crucial in understanding or helping to think through some of these gender and sexuality issues, particularly the way it crosses or doesn't cross with race. And both of their work is very fabulous. I think also both of the organizers, their work, Susan Gall's work in particular, which I'm very familiar with, is absolutely fabulous on particularly issues with language, but a whole variety of other issues. And I guess in terms of my particular angles and works, there's a group of anthropologists who are based in Denmark and Sweden, and they're doing some very interesting work on this kind of concept of grey zones, of both conceptually and physically. And Ida Harbo is one of them, and Martin Demant Fredriksson, and they together co-edited a book called Grey Zones, I think it was called Grey Zones, something like that, where there's a collection in there about new ways of trying to think about getting beyond the problem that anthropologists often have, either of the global or the local, and how to get away from that dichotomy, or how to think about issues such as gender and sexuality in relation to issues which maybe don't work on the same scale. And that book collection, I think, would be very good.
Thank you so much.